summer 1944. A beach in Normandy. A few weeks after DWII. Three of the most powerful men in the American military are standing for a photograph. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. General Henry Hap Arnold, Commander of the entire Army Air Forces. Behind them is a truck, not a tank, not a half-track, a truck with what looks like a small boat hull welded around its body, sitting half on the sand and half in the surf, looking like someone had glued a rowboat to the back of a delivery van. 4 years later, Eisenhower sits down to write his memoir of the war, a book called Crusade in Europe. In it, he makes a list. He says that beyond the obvious weapons of war, there were 5 pieces of equipment that senior officers came to regard as the most vital to victory in Africa and Europe. He names the Jeep, he names the bulldozer, he names the C-47 transport plane, the workhorse that dropped paratroopers and hauled cargo across every front. He names the 2.5-ton truck, the legendary Deuce and a Half, that carried the American Army everywhere it went. And then he names a 5th thing, the truck with the boat hull, the one in the photograph. Eisenhower adds a line that he clearly thought was worth pointing out specifically. Curiously enough, none of these 5 things was designed for combat. That is strange enough on its own. A Supreme Allied Commander, writing 4 years after the most violent war in human history, chooses to spend a page of his memoir not on tanks or fighter planes, but on 5 non-combat tools, and one of them is a truck shaped like a boat. But the stranger part is this. Many of the Army officers who first saw that truck in testing were not impressed by it at all. The program faced real, sustained skepticism before it ever proved itself. This is the story of how it overcame that skepticism, and why a Supreme Allied Commander decided, years later, that a truck which could drive into the ocean deserved to be remembered in the same sentence as the Jeep. To understand why this vehicle mattered, you first have to understand a problem that nobody in 1941 had solved. An army crossing an ocean to fight a war needs a port. Ships need somewhere to dock, cranes to unload them, and roads to move supplies inland. But ports are also the most heavily defended places on any coastline, because everybody knows that's where an invading army has to land. So the planners, staring at maps of North Africa, then Sicily, then France, kept running into the same dead end. If you attack the port directly, it is destroyed in the fighting or wrecked by the defenders before you can use it. If you land somewhere else, on an open beach with no port at all, you have soldiers on the sand and ships sitting offshore and nothing in between to move the food, fuel, and ammunition from one to the other. Landing craft could get troops onto a beach. They could not easily get cargo over open sand without a harbor of any kind, and once unloaded onto the beach, that cargo still had to be hauled inland by men or animals or trucks that didn't exist yet. In 1942, the U.S. Army's National Defense Research Committee set out to solve this, working together with General Motors and a team of naval architects to design an amphibious cargo vehicle. The lead designer was a man named Rod Stevens, Jr., a yacht designer from the New York naval architecture firm Sparkman and Stevens, a firm better known for building America's Cup racing sailboats than military hardware. Working alongside him was Dennis Pouliston, a British-born sailor and ocean adventurer, and Frank Spear, a reserve officer attached to MIT. None of them were truck engineers. What they were was people who understood hulls, water, and how to keep something afloat in rough surf. Their assignment was strange and specific. Take the U.S. Army's standard 2.5-ton cargo truck, the same GMC workhorse that hauled supplies on every front, and figure out how to make it swim. What they built was essentially a watertight steel hull wrapped around the chassis and drivetrain of that same Army truck, with a propeller and rudder added at the back. 6 wheels could still drive on land. A boat hull let it float on water. An early prototype came together quickly, but turning that prototype into a reliable combat vehicle took months of further testing and refinement before it was ready for the field. It went by an internal GMC factory code, DUKW, which, despite decades of people trying to read it as a military acronym, was nothing more than General Motors' own naming system. D for the model year 1942, U for its utility, amphibious purpose, K for front-wheel drive, W for the dual rear axle. Soldiers, predictably, started calling it something simpler. The Duck. Here is the part of the story most people never hear. Many Army officers who evaluated the early Duck were unconvinced by it. It didn't look like a serious piece of equipment, and the program faced real resistance and doubt before it ever fired a shot in anger. While that skepticism was still working its way through the chain of command, something happened that changed the conversation. Near Provincetown, Massachusetts, a storm rolled in. A U.S. Coast Guard vessel ran aground in heavy surf, with 7 men trapped aboard, in conditions too violent for a conventional lifeboat to safely reach them. A Duck happened to be nearby for testing. Rod Stevens and his team drove it straight off the beach and into the surf, out to the stranded boat, and brought all 7 Coast Guardsmen back to shore. It was the kind of rescue a normal vehicle simply could not have attempted, and it became one of the most famous moments in the vehicle's history. The rescue didn't single-handedly flip a switch and launch mass production on its own. Evaluation and testing were already moving forward, but it became the turning point that silenced many of the remaining doubters, and it gave the program the kind of dramatic, undeniable proof that pushed broader military support over the line. One more detail from this early period is worth knowing, because it explains why the Duck worked as well as it did once it reached a real battlefield. A standard truck tire is set at 1 pressure for driving on pavement. That same pressure makes a truck sink and bog down in loose beach sand. Frank Spear's team built the Duck with one of the world's first successful central tire inflation systems, letting the driver adjust tire pressure from inside the cab, on the move, lowering it for soft sand and raising it again for hard roads. Versions of this idea were being explored elsewhere too, but the Duck system was among the earliest to actually work reliably in combat conditions. That kind of central tire inflation is common on many military vehicles today, and it traces a real line back to this odd amphibious truck. In 1944, it was the reason a Duck could drive off a beach that would have stranded an ordinary truck within a few feet of the surf line. From there, the numbers tell the rest of the scale of this thing. Between 1942 and 1945, General Motors built 21,147 of these vehicles, manufactured at the Yellow Truck and Coach plant in Pontiac, Michigan, and later at a second GM plant in St. Louis, Missouri. Most went to American forces. Roughly 2,000 were sent to Britain, and another large allocation to Canada under Lend-Lease. Australia received 535. The Soviet Union received 586, which its forces used to cross rivers and marshland on the Eastern Front. This was, by a wide margin, the most widely produced amphibious vehicle of the entire war on either side. The Duck's defining combat test came in July 1943 during Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. Roughly 1,000 Ducks went ashore with American forces. In the earliest hours of the landing, when many of the larger landing craft and ships could not get close enough to the beach because of shallow water and obstacles, accounts describe a group of Ducks carrying ammunition and shore regiment equipment straight off the ships, across the beach, and well inland to the waiting troops, in continuous runs that no conventional landing craft could have managed. The exact tonnage and distance vary slightly depending on the source, but the broader picture is consistent. It performed far beyond what anyone expected, and stopped being viewed as an experimental gimmick. 11 months later came Normandy. Around 2,000 Ducks went ashore on June 6th, and in the days after, organized into 19 amphibious truck companies, 12 assigned to Omaha Beach and 7 to Utah Beach. Their job was brutally simple and absolutely essential. Before the artificial Mulberry harbors were fully operational, and especially after a storm destroyed one of those 2 harbors, the one built off Omaha Beach. In the days after the landing, the Ducks were one of the only ways to keep ammunition, fuel, and food flowing from the ships anchored offshore to the men fighting their way inland. They shuttled back and forth between ship and shore for as long as the crews could keep them running, carrying cargo that conventional landing craft could not deliver once the tide went out or the surf picked up. The Duck fought just as hard in the Pacific. It had already proven itself there earlier, supplying marine reinforcements at Guadalcanal before it ever reached Sicily. It went on to serve in nearly every major island assault that followed, hauling ammunition, supplies, and even towed artillery pieces like the 105mm howitzer across coral reefs and surf that wrecked conventional landing craft. At Iwo Jima, in February 1945, ducks belonging to the 476th Amphibian Truck Company drove their cargo past the rows of freshly dug graves of Marines who had died taking that same stretch of black volcanic sand days earlier, a detail captured in surviving combat photographs from the island. None of this is the kind of thing that shows up in a general's after-action report about a battle won or lost. Nobody wrote home about how the war was decided by tire pressure. And that is exactly why Eisenhower's decision to put this strange little truck on his short list of 5 vital tools is so revealing. He was not a combat general in the way Patton was. He was chosen as Supreme Allied Commander largely because of his skill at organizing and coordinating an enormous, complicated machine made of millions of men and an even larger number of trucks, ships, and supply lines. When Eisenhower looked back at what actually won the war in Europe, he didn't reach first for the weapons that get remembered. He reached for the things that helped solve one of the Army's hardest logistics problems. How do you keep an army supplied once it is standing on a beach with no port behind it? That is the pattern behind almost every story like this one. The decisive factor in a war is very often not the weapon that gets the headline. It is the unglamorous system, built by people nobody remembers, that makes everything else possible. A team of yacht designers who had never built a military vehicle before helped solve a problem that had stumped Army planners for years, and they did it with a steel hull, a propeller, and an adjustable tire pump. Nobody gave them a parade. But the next time you see an old black and white photograph of a beach in Normandy or an island in the Pacific, and you notice a strange shape moving through the surf that looks half truck and half boat, you'll know exactly what you're looking at, and exactly why a Supreme Allied Commander thought it deserved to be remembered. If stories like this one, about the people and machines history quietly left out of the textbook version of the war, are the kind of thing you want more of, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I'll keep digging up the next one.